Hey, everybody, I hope you all are doing well and welcome back to Michael's Matters. And I, of course, am Michael. And at the end of this last year, I had seen so many articles about this great resignation and the labor to participation rate basically being very, very low, and that many, many, many older Americans had basically just disappeared from the workforce. Some of them got taken out of commission because of the pandemic, some of them got laid off, and also many decided to retire earlier, much, much earlier than they had even initially anticipated. Looking at some of the newest information about retirement in the last couple of years, it shows that millions of Americans who are not yet in their golden years during the pandemic decided to jump into retirement way earlier than they expected. In fact, according to a report by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, there was a huge spike in 2022 in the number of people who became retired versus the number that was initially going to be expected to. But now, as the world has gotten back to normal and the economy is doing better, but potentially in a precarious position and recession and economic downturn, etc., we are starting to see that some folks are having to backtrack on their retirement decisions and jump back into the workforce, which is a bit awkward to say the least. But this got me thinking, how does one retire early? And moreover, and most important, and really ultimately most important, how much money would someone need to retire early? So today we are talking about how much do you need to retire early and what are some of those important things to consider. And spoiler alert, it's not $1 million. Now, this is Michael's Matters, and before we get to it, if you like these videos, if you find them interesting, if you find them helpful, if you at least find them useful, please don't forget to like and subscribe. That way you can get updates when our newest and most informative videos become available. But now, let's get down to the video. So, over the last couple of years, especially as a result of the pandemic, millions upon millions of Americans jumped into retirement early. One of the biggest drivers of this was the pandemic, obviously, which saw many jobs disappear, slow down, or at least be paused. And if you look at the labor force participation rate for folks who are in their older ages, 65 plus, for example, starting in 2020, in the height of pandemic, there was a sizable dip in the labor force participation. And even up to today, it is still yet to recover. In these years is when a large portion of Americans who were 50 years old or above too also had a moment to think about what they wanted to the rest of their life to look like. And in fact, 3.5 million older Americans decided that they didn't want to do whatever they were doing, and they went into early retirement. This was made possible in large part due to the flaming dump trucks of government money that was directly sent out to folks to help them through the pandemic, that also trickled up into the economy, into businesses, and through financial markets into people's 401ks, stocks and bonds, real estate, etc., creating an everything bubble that caused assets like houses, cars, watches, eggs, gas, basically everything to raise in their value exponentially. All this meant that older Americans had more money in the shorter period of time than pretty much anyone had planned for, and that provided a potential exit point to do what is part of the American dream, which is to retire early. So they sold their houses, they sold their cars, and moved their financial assets from inflated, pricey, risky assets to safer assets, and took the plunge into the life of leisure and relaxation of retirement, at least so far. But now that we are in the post-pandemic world and people have had the opportunity to see what it really looks like to retire early, emotionally, socially, as well as most importantly financially, and with a looming recession and massive inflation and additional costs, some retirees are finding their worst fears are coming true of having to go back to work. That money that they saved or the amount that they thought they could live on is actually getting eaten away by things like inflation and taxes and healthcare. And these folks are going back to work to tread financial water. So, how much does one need to potentially avoid these situations? Before we get to the number about how much you would need to have to retire, you would need to know what your costs are going to look like. And this is going to change pretty wildly depending on your specific life situation, where you live, whether you're married or not, do you own a home, do you rent, do you have a mortgage? All those things are going to factor into it. Furthermore, prognosticating the cost of literally everything and anything that you may have to spend money on for the entirety of the rest of your life is pretty daunting to say the least. But there are a few rules of thumb that seem to be a good place to start. So the first one that I thought was interesting is from this FIRE movement, which is a movement of people who plan to retire early, mainly by increasing their savings dramatically and also sort of messing with what is the definition of retirement. That aside, the FIRE process is to first begin by saving as much of your income as possible, ideally 50% or more. Then is to figure out what is your yearly cost of living right now and apply a multiple of 25 to it to give you your savings amount that you need to have for your nest egg for the rest of your life. And then plan out a way to not spend more than 4% of your savings. All the while putting that additional money, that nest egg, into a tax advantaged investment or other investments that will produce an average of 3.5 to 4.0% growth a year. So let's do an example of this using the average American's household spending. So in 2022, the average monthly household cost in the United States was $5,111 per month. Of course, this is going to change depending on where you live and your family size and the car you drive and the cereal you eat, and pretty much everything will have a minor change to this. But again, this is just the average. Additionally, the average household income in the United States came out to about $77,999 per year. That is for white Americans. That's according to the U.S. Census Bureau. We'll just save that for a little bit later. So if we have a monthly expense of $5,111 a month under the FIRE calculation, we multiply that by 12 to get the yearly cost, which comes out to $61,332 a year in cost, plus a 12% cushion, which comes out to $12,266 for good measure. Add those together, and voila, you have a total yearly expense cost of $73,598, which is a lot to say the least. Now, the next step is to apply that 25 rule to it to give you an idea of what your nest egg should be. So if we multiply that $73,598 times 25, you end up with a whopping $1,839,960 in savings that you would need to have in order to retire early under the FIRE method, which is, again, a Vesuvius amount of money. Now, one last assumption for this style of dead reckoning for retirement is that this money would not be just sitting in cash in your bank, where it would obviously get eaten away by inflation, but rather it would be invested in more secure types of investments that would have an average rate of return of about 4% or above, which over the lifespan would be at least keeping up with the cost of inflation on average that we see, which is estimated to be around 3.5% over the long run, although right now it's sitting at 6.0% based off the new BLS information for this month. Now, there are obviously a couple problems with this model. First is that it is oversimplified. Second is that it doesn't really have a great way to calculate the unknown costs, which could upend this whole thing. Yes, there is a 20% cushion, but that could be wiped out by one good earthquake or a tsunami or even a heart attack. Second is that it doesn't really seem to be applicable or even doable for everybody. Just looking at the average American income versus their expenses, and that is for white Americans, and we use that number because that's the only one that really worked, is that even if these folks saved 100% of their income after their expense came out, that leaves them basically with only $4,401 a year worth of savings. And so essentially to get that $1.8 million nest egg, they'd have to save all their money for 418 years before they hit that number. So these numbers don't seem to even really pan out for some of the highest earning segments of the American economy. And it looks even less plausible when we look at all their races. We look at African Americans, we look at Hispanics. That number is just undoable. So I think one of the biggest problems with this model is that it's really going to apply to a very specific high income individual who has low monthly costs and has an income that they can save a lot. And I don't know about you all, that doesn't fit most of America. Overall, looking at what are the potential costs to retiring, even on time, where, if you want to retire at 65 or 67, depending on when you're born, that's when Social Security kicks in, let alone to trying to do it early. I mean, this is just daunting, right? It's just very, very daunting. The reasons are pretty self-evident because the fact that you are trying to solve essentially a calculus problem where there is an unknown amount of time, an unknown amount of money, an unknown costs that are all changing minute by minute, let alone decade by decade. And the only real thing that you know is that you exist. Not to get too Cartesian on you. So with parameters like that, it seems almost impossible, but this point of this whole video is that there is at least some rules of thumb, some basic assumptions that people can make to at least get an idea about where that cost is at. So for example, inflation rate of 3%, a good cushion of 20% on top of what your yearly calculations are, and how to calculate an estimated, even if it's a very rough estimation of how much money you need to know before you take that done. All right, so that's it for today's Michael's Matters, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. And if you did, if you found it interesting, if you found it helpful, or hey, you know what, if you found it useful, please don't forget to like and subscribe. That way, you can get updates when our newest and most informative videos become available. So, for Michael's Matters, I'm hoping that you take care of yourself, take care of others, and have a happy, healthy